Hi all. Sorry I'm not here to present in person, but I hope this is helpful, and I hope the technology works. Um, okay, so Oren Starn is writing about the rondas campesinas in Peru, in northern Peru specifically. So they spring up in the late 1970s. They involve hundreds of thousands of participants. They successfully reduced crime, then expanded to justice provision before facing state repression and decreasing organization by the late 80s. So I think also importantly, sort of the time of their decline, the Peruvian state is functioning better by the mid '90s or late '90s even, and I think then at some point the need to personally prevent crime or provide justice is not quite as pressing. So I think there's structural, sort of well as agentic reasons for the Ronda's decline. So I just want to talk about a couple different themes throughout the book. So I'll just start with positionality. I think it's a you know. It's clearly a big issue in the book. So I mean, I think as Gil had introduced the book to us as, Starn has this sort of quirky way of inserting himself into the narrative. Um, so we learned about his relationship with Robin Kirk, his college days and backpacking and all that stuff. Um, so I mean, I think we can at least say that even if we find it too much, I think it's at least really helpful for aspiring researchers to see the quandaries he faced while researching the book. So I think that the little things that impact doing research in other settings, people asking you for loans, long truck rides across the desert, these all sort of small challenges or small issues that just sort of affect his everyday life. So I feel like just thinking about doing research myself, it's important, or it's interesting and helpful just to hear what someone else went through, and how they responded to the stuff they faced. Um, I mean, I think sometimes it can approach maybe I or in Starn, sort of narrative. And he seems very impacted by the self-reflexive turn in anthropology. I mean, he's not doing like just an autoethnography, and there's not maybe the jargon that's sometimes associated with that sort of work. But I think that influence comes through pretty clearly. I think also, I think it came up in one of the memos. He really does clearly establish many close relationships with research subjects in the book. And I think it's clear that he's quite close with a lot of the people. I think it also puts him sometimes in morally ambiguous situations, like when he's asked for loans. Maybe he wouldn't even need to be close for that to happen, but certainly that sort of is a accelerating factor. Or certainly, I think the key sort of example of that in the book is the torture of the suspected thief that he witnesses, and in that case, he just kind of freezes. I think so while there may be sort of while well I'll say so. I mean, I think it does produce sort of occasionally really beautiful, evocative writing. So like when he's talking about the death of the child from some disease, I mean, I think it's really sort of painful and personal, and I think that really actually helps sort of us understand what people are going through, because he really was quite close to them. But I think sometimes he does kind of overshare. So again, this came up in one of the memos talking about trysts or stealing. Does he really need to talk about this? He does use pseudonyms, but not for everyone. And you do wonder if some people maybe would think, I didn't want this much of my dirty laundry aired in the book. So I think another theme I just want to talk about is sort of how he talks about interconnectedness and globalization. So I think one of the real strengths of the book is demolishing these stereotypes of the rural Andes as isolated, stuck to custom, and pre-political. So I think he shows how campesinos are both tuned into national politics, holding strong opinions themselves, and are deeply affected by government policies. So also that he talks about how even sort of beyond that, they're existing in the global world. So they're interacting with with the foreign through migration, international NGOs, global norms. So I mean, I think he's not sort of trying to do like a global multi-site ethnography, but I think he's not shy about letting those influences come in. I think he's also showing that it's not just that other things are coming in and affecting campesinos; that campesino life is sort of reaching out and affecting Peru. So, he writes about, for example, that increasing campesino influence in politics meant by the 1980s, politicians couldn't just come and, act like the boss or act like the landlord. They had to don ponchos and they had to promise to work on rural issues when campaigning in rural areas. I think there's increasing back and forth, or maybe not increasing, but certainly back and forth between the rural areas and sort of the metropoles. I think also just notable is that, he shows that during the 1980s, the rondas were one of the few Peruvian institutions that actually worked. This sets it up differently than many sort of classical accounts of maybe rural backwardness. Another theme I want to talk about is how he portrays hierarchy, or how he talks about power relations in the book. I think one example that he talks about sort of the complicated nature of power relations is he shows, for example, in his chapter on women, while rondas provided some opportunities for women to get justice that's not provided by the courts, the deck is basically stacked against them. And over time, they become increasingly uninvolved in the ronda committees because of, sort of difficulty navigating gender hierarchies. So I think, his broad point on hierarchy is pushing back against the Foucauldian idea that any attempt to impose order is oppressive. So I think he has a more contingent understanding of authority. It's not absolute, it's always contested. And it really depends on who's organizing for what and with what power structure. We can't sort of just look at all attempts to organize order as oppressive. So I think he's also really departing from more doctrinaire left-wing leftist approaches, maybe similar to Foucauldian approaches on hierarchy. So, the rondas, for example, they do push back against state authority, but they're not revolutionaries. They only really do it when the state is actively intervening in their lives in a negative way. And I think he's also insistent about the need not to write about the rondas as sort of a sui generis phenomenon that's specific to campesinos. It comes organically out of campesino life. It was initially encouraged basically by low-level state actors. And I think this is another, one of his efforts to push back against overly rosy narratives of, left-wing ideas. And I think in many ways you can see how in this moment, this sort of connects back to positionality. He's sort of writing for his 22-year-old self. And I think a lot of the book is sort of like that, trying to push back on this sort of idealistic vision of indigenous organization or peasant campesino organization, and sort of trying to deal with the divisions, the difficulties, the sort of lack of mobilization when it happens, and trying to be not just the maybe good leftist that he thought he was at 22 years old. I think he has sort of a similar approach to NGOs, the sort of more ambiguous one, where he's quite critical the ways that they can be corrupt, arrogant, apolitical, but also that they do help the rondas do things that they wouldn't have been able to do by themselves, like gain an international profile. But I think also, while in some ways I appreciated his treatment of NGOs, he does do kind of a lot of fence sitting, where he's like, well, on the one hand and on the other hand. And sometimes you just, or at least I felt sort of wanting him to take a side and say, yes, it's complex, but we can make this judgment. And he doesn't often do that. I think also his final chapter that specifically focuses on hierarchy is fascinating because I think it paints a pretty grim picture about the possibility for long-term autonomous campesino organization. And so, basically he describes that, there's so much time and money that it took for ronda presidents to, organize beyond their village. And that, the sort of, because it took so much money, maybe some of them did take some money to support this, which is, understandable. But this also created a lot of jealousy and frustration. There's also political divides within the village that made it difficult for a single ronda president to, keep his authority. And it left me wondering if basically the combination of general poverty, the time-intensive nature of agriculture, and the lack of cell phones meant it was basically always going to be impossible for the rondas to organize beyond individual villages. So, I think Polly in her memo called this these hyper-local phenomenon. And I think, that that's a pretty good description of what it was. It was, often quite active in the village, in individual villages, but had trouble expanding beyond that. And I think also the way he talked about how presidents were stuck, I sort of mentioned this, but this impossible position, was interesting. And again, not quite the doctrinaire leftist approach that I think he's pushing back on, that he sees himself as having, as a 22-year-old. So I also want to talk about, finally, just the comparison with the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path. So I think his decision to focus on the rondas and not Sendero Luminoso was largely a political decision. So he wants to, show a movement for liberation, even if it's an imperfect one. And I think he does make the point, and this is empirical justification, that Sendero Luminoso involved many fewer people than the rondas. So true. But I don't think he fully recognizes that, or in this book at least, that Sendero Luminoso was also a campesino phenomenon for some of the same reason the rondas were. So upwardly mobile campesinos who buy into the dream of progress, just like many of those in Starn's work, the specifically Peruvian dream of progress, were stymied by an economic crisis and a lack of educational opportunities in the Ayacucho region. And Sendero Luminoso, like the rondas, make their appeal initially on their ability to stop crime, to punish rustlers. And their punishments were generally more severe, but I think basically it comes from the same problem of insecurity, caused by a negligent state. So a middle-class vanguard certainly plays a larger role in Sendero Luminoso than in the rondas, but I think we also shouldn't underestimate the sincerity of belief in lower-level participants. That the Sendero Luminoso was the scientifically historical correct approach. It was going to bring the revolution, etc. And I think the same idealism and drive he admires in someone like Daniel Idrogo basically goes horribly wrong with Sendero Luminoso. And I think it makes Sendero a much more politically difficult story to tell to his 22-year-old self. And I think, he's pushing back against left-wing approaches, and maybe he doesn't quite know what to do with Sendero. So also I want to talk just briefly about Shining and Other Paths. I've read 2 chapters from it. And so one of them focuses on gender, and I just want to relate it back to how Starn talks about gender. So this is from the Cordero chapter on gender. So let me just read a quote. So Shining Path's ideology and actions on gender were contradictory. On the one hand, they conceive of politicians, and particularly war, as the work of machos and attack their opponents as fags, maricones, cowards, and little women, mujercitas. On the other hand, they made significant efforts to recruit women and constituted women's committees within the party structure and at the level of the mass front, Frente de Masa, in Ayacucho. So I think, we see in some ways the similarities with the rondas. There were efforts to involve women, but basically they still use gender language, gendered understandings of power to structure their organizations. And women in Sendero Luminoso, according to Cordero, were promoted for loyalty rather than military or political skill. Again, I think a similarity to the rondas. I think a major difference between how women were approached in Sendero and the rondas is that Sendero basically wanted women to fully give themselves to the movement and renounce domestic responsibilities and family ties. So that's totally different from the rondas for sure. Also, there's a chapter on popular committees written by Ponciano del Pino. And so basically the argument there is that they were initially pretty flexible in dealing with local needs, but over time, when the Sendero Luminoso started losing territory, these popular committees, which were basically just, local branches of Sendero Luminoso involving, people who lived in the village. So they stopped basically funding the popular committees, and Sendero Luminoso, instead of working with people to organize, basically becomes increasingly racist, hierarchical, and violent toward campesinos. So I think, again, we see a different trajectory. The rondas never really developed into an armed group separate from campesinos, from campesino organizations, where Sendero Luminoso, over the course of its existence, sort of moved farther and farther away. Okay, so that's all I have to say, and I hope your discussion goes well.